Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture. We are thrilled to welcome you this evening. I'm Manoj Mohanan. I'm the Interim Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. This is the 100th year of Duke University, and today's event is a special centennial event. This lecture series is generously endowed by the William R. Kenan Jr. Charitable Trust, and we are thrilled to partner with Duke's program in American Grant Strategy today to bring you this important conversation. This talk is the first of our fall lecture series showcasing Sanford's dedication to media, democracy, and civil discourse. Two quick announcements. On September 9th, please join us for a special talk featuring former Senator Richard Burr and our Provost Alec Gallimore on Bridging the Divide. And on October 29th, do join us for our Rubenstein Distinguished Lecture featuring author and journalist David Brooks on how to know a person. You can find out about these and other events online at sanford.duke.edu. We invite you to check your email and give us feedback about the event at the end of this talk. Please don't use your email phones to check messages while the talk is on. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers very briefly and get tonight's program underway. First, our distinguished guest, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Ms. Cheney, as you know, Ms. Cheney was the third highest ranking Republican in the House of Representatives and then later served as the vice chair of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack. She's also author of an amazing book called Oath and Honor that documents the events and aftermath of January 6th, one of the most important days in the recent history of our country. She's joined by Professor Peter Feaver, who is director of the Duke program in American Grant Strategy, and we look forward to the talk. Thank you both. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it is an honor to be on stage with you, and you, as you know, I've been chasing you for years to try to land you. I'm so glad we did. What a pivotal time.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember when you were a Republican, so talk to me a little bit about that.
Me too. No, look, I think that, first of all, it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be here with you, Peter, and have the chance to talk about the challenges and the stakes that we're facing, certainly in this election cycle. You know, I think that if you look at what's happened to the Republican Party, you know, it's possible to look back to a moment sort of at the end of January 2021, when, you know, the party did have an opportunity to say, we reject what has happened, we reject attempts, the former president's efforts to seize power, to overturn an election, and we're now going to focus on the future. And I think that's clearly what we should have done. But if you look back to that moment, there really was a choice that the elected officials in the party had to make. They were confronted with this choice between upholding the Constitution or supporting Donald Trump, and they chose Donald Trump. And I think that what we have seen since then really does flow very much from that choice, and I don't say that with anything but sadness for what the party has become.
Well, we're going to dig into that in a moment. Let me take you back further to when you were comfortably in the middle of the Republican Party, maybe even on the hawkish side. You know, I'm thinking when you and I served in the Bush administration, you were very tough on Republican issues in Middle East especially. And in 2017, you know, initially you were voting with President Trump on much of his policies. So talk a little bit about what that was like. What was your thinking? Did you change or did he change? Yeah.
Yeah, I have not changed in terms of my substantive policy views. I really began my career in public service, focused on national security, foreign policy, working on U.S. economic development assistance around the world, and very much grew up in a Republican Party that was characterized by the need for a strong national defense. Reagan's Republican Party, the first vote I ever cast. I was 18 years old in 1984 and voted for Ronald Reagan. And so, I believe firmly in these issues around the need for a strong national defense, not because they're Republican, but because I believe that, history has shown that that's what's necessary to preserve our freedom. And, the party used to be organized around substance and policy, and certainly we would have debates inside the party about policy issues, but the party is no longer today characterized by substance, characterized by policy. And so I think that's, much of the work that we're going to have to do sort of post this election cycle is getting back to a place where this country has, two strong political parties that embrace the Constitution and where we can have substantive debates, because I think the future of the country requires that.
In the 2016 campaign, I think you initially were with Jeb Bush, and until that went the way of all flesh. Did you then join on the Trump bandwagon, left of election, before election? Did you endorse him in 2016?
I did, and I was running for the first time myself that year, believed very much that he represented the policies, some of which I've talked about, and it's interesting because I think you can look at sort of the first couple of years when I was in Congress. My first term started in January of 2017. Paul Ryan was the speaker, and I certainly did not agree with everything that the Trump administration was doing, and I spoke out. For example, when Donald Trump said, standing next to Vladimir Putin, that he trusted Putin more than he trusted his own intelligence officials, when he, said that NATO was obsolete, I spoke out. But I certainly, I was in House Republican leadership. We were absolutely engaged in substantive and political battles with the Democrats, and I was very firmly on the Republican side of those issues.
And in that 2016 campaign, he ran partially against Hillary Clinton, but also partially against the Bush administration. So ran against Bush's position on Iraq and even on Iran to a certain extent. So was that conflicting? I'm trying to probe this scab if I can.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the first times that I was at the White House when Donald Trump was the president, I took a group of freshman Republicans who, and there may have been a member or two who wasn't a freshman, but Republican members who were veterans. And I actually had been called by a couple of people inside the Trump administration to say, he's listening to Rand Paul way too much. Mm-hmm. And we need you to come in and, and I thought it would be good to bring veterans and talk to him about America's role in the world and why it's so important for America not to be isolationist, not to retreat. And so those were sort of the initial substantive discussions. And I think in many ways, these policy issues, and I'm certainly happy to talk about the, extent to which the Republican Party is in many ways embraced in isolationism, rejecting support, for example, for Ukraine. But I think those issues matter hugely, but I don't think this is a policy election, because I think that what Donald Trump represents and what he poses is a very grave and direct threat to the foundations of the Republic, based upon what he's done, what we watched him do, and what he's promised he'll do again.
Two more questions about that period, and then we'll bring us to the 2020 elections. one of the things that the media loved to do is whenever the president would tweet out something outrageous, to run to members of Congress and say, what do you think about this, with a microphone on. Now, if they asked folks like us out in the cheap seats, we could say what we thought. Talk a little bit about the pressure you felt as an elected politician caught between your voters who might not have been bothered by that tweet and you who knew what was wrong.
I didn't really feel the pressure that way. I can remember very clearly my dad telling me because he was in Congress, he had the seat that I held, and I can remember him telling me that the way that he addressed this issue of how do you represent your constituents is to do what you know is right, and then you go home and explain what you've done. Now, most of the time, the way that I was voting was not a way that would require a huge amount of explanation, because I, am a conservative. I believe in those issues. Obviously, when we got to impeachment, it did require significant explanation. But so I, in my view, and I think if you go back and you look at the record, certainly on the issues that I was focused on having to do with national security policy, I did not feel the need to suggest that somehow an isolationist pursuit of policy was sufficient. Mm-hmm. I think you raise an important point, though. If you look at the way that Trump has conducted himself, the way that he operates, very often there have been situations where he will say something that is outrageous, that is indefensible, and in a way we've become numb to it now. But for some time there were people around him, I think, Jared Kushner, for example, who would say, oh, no, he didn't mean that. Here's what he meant. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when Trump said, yes, I took all these classified documents, I had the right to take all the classified documents, they're mine, I'm the president, I could do whatever I want with them, Kushner would come out and say, oh, what he means is he's building his presidential library, and, he's... So, I think when people look back and study this time, looking at sort of those translators, the people who took the most outrageous things and made them seem like they were reasonable, I think is an important area to look at.
And the second question from this time period, probably your toughest vote, maybe, was your vote on the first impeachment. And I bet half of the room would guess that you voted in favor of the first impeachment, but you did not. So can you explain your thinking? Yeah,
and this actually very much informed my work on the Select Committee, looking back at that first impeachment. I think that the responsibility of impeachment is a very grave, significant constitutional obligation. And I think that during the first impeachment, the Democrats refused to pursue people they should have pursued. I think they should have more aggressively pursued John Bolton, for example. I think that they should have put on a case that left no doubt, that wasn't based on hearsay, which this case, as they presented it, was. And so as I looked at that vote and I looked at what our obligation was and what the requirements were to demonstrate impeachable conduct, they hadn't met it. Now, if you fast forward to the Select Committee on January 6th and how we conducted ourselves, we were very clear from the very beginning that we were going to pursue an aggressive litigation strategy, that we were going to enforce our subpoenas, that we were not going to pull our punches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's Election Day 2020. when did you start to get worried that things might go sideways, that we wouldn't have the orderly transition that we've more or less had in modern time?
Yeah, in the day or two after the election, I mean, certainly Trump said some things in the run-up to the election, which I commented on publicly at the time about, he suggested maybe we can postpone the elections because of COVID. There are a couple of other things he said that, were clearly troubling. I assumed after the election, all right, look, he's lost. He has the right to pursue challenges that, he believes he's got grounds to pursue. I thought we would go through a day or two maybe of that, then he would concede. And I actually went to see Kevin McCarthy just a couple of days after the election. And he told me that he had talked to President Trump and that Trump knew he lost. And as Kevin described it, he said he's got to go through all the stages of grief. So, let's let him do that. And, it occurred to me that for him, the stages of grief included tweeting in all caps, crazy things. But so I think everybody sort of thought, all right, this will come to an end. In the middle of November, when it clearly hadn't, and his charges, his allegations became wilder and wilder. And, it got to a point where I put out a statement, again, as a Republican member of the House leadership, saying, look, if the president has evidence to back up these claims, he's got to produce that evidence. But otherwise, it is incumbent upon him and all of us to respect the sanctity of our election process. And I think that, you began to see very clearly that this was going down a dangerous path. Now, I did not know at the time, obviously, everything that we learned since. And I think a couple of very important things for people to remember. In the Select Committee report, we included in the executive summary a chart that walks through the date on which Donald Trump was told by senior officials, and we named them by, his attorney general, his acting attorney general, the chairman of his campaign, his White House counsel, the date on which he was told, each of his assertions and allegations was untrue, and then, the date directly afterwards where he went out and said them again anyway. So he knew what he was saying wasn't true. Of course, he did bring claims. They lost 61 out of 62 cases, and the one in which they prevailed wouldn't have changed the outcome. So he was very clearly at that point engaged in an effort, to try to subvert the election, to try to overturn the election.
And then in December, you organized the former secretaries of defense to weigh in with a letter. First of all, congrats on staffing that. That must have been difficult to get the group.
Eric Edelman was a big help on that as well. But
what was your concern? And that's addressing a nightmare scenario that we didn't get to, but what was your concern that motivated that?
Yeah, there had been, we were hearing suggestions, including, Mike Flynn, retired General Mike Flynn, who had been the head of DIA and very briefly the National Security Advisor for President Trump. He suggested that Donald Trump should deploy the military to seize voting machines and rerun the election in swing states. And so there were sort of repeated suggestions that that there were plans underway like that. And there was a column that appeared by David Ignatius, somebody I've known for a long time, who has very good sources inside the Pentagon. Of course, we were talking to people as well, and there was real concern that the president, of course, you had Chris Miller, who'd been put in as the Secretary of Defense.
Acting.
Acting Secretary of Defense, that they would use the military to play a role in the election. You'd had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had to issue a statement saying, U.S. military has no role in our elections. Of course, we know now, because of the work of the Select Committee, that the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army issued a similar statement, I think actually an identical statement to the one General Milley issued, saying the United States military has no role to play in our elections. And after that statement appeared, Trump threatened to fire them if they ever issued such a statement again. So there's a very real concern at the time that subsequently has been borne out. And we wanted to send a clear signal that this is above politics, that the military has no role to play, that those in positions of authority in the Pentagon also had a responsibility to facilitate a smooth transition to the Biden administration. And of course, there also were briefings that had been stopped and information sharing that had stopped. And it was such a significant set of concerns, recognizing that the peaceful transfer of power is foundational. It's at the heart of the survival of the republic. And so when it became clear that was threatened, it was unprecedented and actually not difficult to get all the living secretaries of defense to agree to sign on to this public warning. Another thing that's important to remember, I think David Ignatius suggested in his column that we should have a delegation of Republicans go see Trump and basically tell him it's over and you can't use the military to stay in power. But the reason that we decided on this very public letter was because two things. One, it was hard to imagine what delegation of Republicans was willing to do that, which is very troubling. But secondly, we knew it wouldn't have an impact. It had to be a public warning because a private discussion with Donald Trump in this time period, certainly as we know now, would not have had the impact it needed to have.
And then, of course, it culminates on January 6th. You've elsewhere said that after January 6th, many of your Republican colleagues told you privately, okay, that was a bridge too far. He's done. I'm breaking with him. It's time to move on. You did that, but the rest of them, or many of them, did not. So explain what happened there. I understand why you did the choice you did. What's your understanding of why they made the choice they did?
Cowardice. And it was a time of testing, and it was a moment, I suppose, you don't think that you're really going to ever face these moments. And certainly if you had asked all of the Republicans, what would you do if you came to a moment where you had to stand for the Constitution, even though it wasn't in your political interest? Beforehand, everyone would say, yes, of course, I'm standing for the Constitution. But there were a whole sequence of events. One was Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago. And so, Trump has left office, and we now know, of course, there was grave concern, including in his inner circle, about what he might do in the period between January 6th and January 20th. And, people being warned about, keeping the crazies away from him. I mean, it was a perilous period of time. But sort of at the moment when we thought we were past all of this and we could move on, all of a sudden I looked at my phone and there was a picture of Kevin McCarthy, who was then the Republican leader in the House, standing next to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. This is, just after Trump left office. And, it was a stunning thing. I went to see Kevin the next day, and I walked into his office and I said, Mar-a-Lago, what the hell? What are you doing? And he actually said to me, I was in Florida anyway. And he said, and the president's staff is really worried about him because he's not eating. Now, that was obviously not true. But the reality was that after the Republicans continued to vote to object to the electoral votes after the violence, so the night that we came back, and they continued, I think 147 voted to object after the violence, many of the largest corporations in the country announced they would not be donating to Republicans. Mm-hmm. And some announced they wouldn't be donating to either party, they were staying out of politics, but a significant number of them said, essentially, this was an insurrection and we're not going to provide campaign backing, campaign funding for people who supported it. So Kevin needed money. Mm. And he needed access to Donald Trump's donor lists. Donald Trump had, lists of small dollar donors. And he was willing, basically, to bring Donald Trump, who had instigated the attack on the Capitol, willing to bring him back into the fold in exchange for access to those lists. And leadership matters. And so that signal was a very clear one to many Republicans. Look, just don't oppose this, don't object to it. It's going to be a problem for you if you do. So on the House side, we had an embrace of Trump going on. On the Senate side, Leader McConnell took a different approach. He did not embrace Trump. He was very clear and eloquent about Trump's culpability, and Kevin had said Trump was culpable too, but McConnell condemned Trump and what he had done, but then he proceeded to say we just need to ignore Trump, and if we just don't, it was sort of like don't talk about him and he'll go away, which again sort of created this notion of, well, it's not such a big threat. If we're not going to actually confront and defeat him, then it must not be such a big threat. So there were a variety of reasons why we ended up where we are, but it's really a stunning thing if you think about the path the Republican Party has traveled, in the course of the last over 3 years.
I have two other possible explanations that are probably complementary. One is everyone thought someone else would bell the cat, so they didn't have to.
Yeah.
And I think in Leader McConnell's case, he probably calculated that there's no way Trump can come back from this, so I don't need to have my fingerprints on the dagger.
Yeah, but I don't disagree. But I think that it points to what is your responsibility if you're in a position of public trust. And it was a time when I think you couldn't make a political calculation about, how are we going to make sure that we don't actually confront him and he'll go away anyway. I mean, obviously, as we sit here today, it didn't work.
So let me ask you about your work on the Select Committee. Answer one of these two questions, whichever one you want. What was the thing you discovered that most shocked or surprised you? And/or what is the thing that you discovered that you believe the Americans have forgotten with our short-term memory, and 4 years later, or we need to be reminded?
Well, I want to answer both, but I'll do it quickly. I think the thing that most shocked and surprised me was the breadth and the depth of Donald Trump's plan to overturn the election, and the multiple parts to it, from pressuring the state legislatures to come into session and throw out the electoral votes for Biden and cast their votes for Trump, pressuring the vice president, obviously, pressuring the Justice Department, mobilizing the mob, the fact that he knew the mob was armed, and sent them to the Capitol. So the thing that, on one hand, that I think was the most surprising was how broad and deep this plan was.
Was it systematic and coordinated, or was it throwing spaghetti against the wall and hoping something would work?
Well, Donald Trump was responsible for every piece of it, and I think that what you see is that each time something was tried and failed, he would move on to the next piece of it. I think that what also surprised me was how close we came. And that's where I think the courage of people who stood against him, people like Rusty Bowers in Arizona, people inside the White House like Cassidy Hutchinson and Sarah Matthews, who came and testified.
So close, not just on January 6th, but you're talking about along the way.
Yeah, but how close we came on January 6th to a far worse constitutional crisis.
Okay.
And of course, the courage of Vice President Pence. And I think it's important to recognize, if Vice President Pence had not withstood the pressure from Donald Trump to act in a way that was illegal and unconstitutional, we would have been in a very much more serious constitutional crisis. But J.D. Vance, who is currently Donald Trump's running mate, has said specifically, repeatedly, that he will not do what Mike Pence did were he ever to face that situation. I think that's critically important. But the thing that I think people have to commit themselves not to forget is what Donald Trump did during the 187 minutes. So Donald Trump had mobilized this mob. He knew they were armed. He fed them with lies about the election. He sent them to the Capitol armed. And then he gets back to the White House. And he gets back to the White House within 15 minutes of walking off stage at the Ellipse. He's told by a White House employee, there's a riot at the Capitol. So he knows when he walks back into the Oval Office, there's violence at the Capitol. Then he goes into his dining room and he turns on the television and he watches the violence at the Capitol. Go watch the video of what was happening on the west front of the Capitol, the police officers being beaten viciously by people carrying Trump flags, with Trump flags. He watched people assault our Capitol in his name. He sat there as members of his family, as members of his staff, pleaded with him, tell the mob to stop. They pleaded with him, and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't tell the mob to stop. He instead sent out a tweet saying Mike Pence doesn't have the courage to do what needed to be done. He poured gasoline on the fire of the attack. He was given a note at one point that said a civilian had been shot at the entrance to the House chamber. And he put the note down on the dining room table and he still refused to act. So he was watching people be beaten. He was watching the most important building in our democracy be assaulted by a mob that he had mobilized. His vice president had to be evacuated for his own safety. People are pleading with him. He could have walked, I mean, you know this, Peter, he could have walked a few feet down the hall to the White House briefing room where there is a camera on all the time. He could have walked down the hall and said, go home, stop, leave the Capitol. And he wouldn't do it. And the pure depravity of an individual watching this violent assault that he's instigated, watching people in his name assault our democracy, attack police officers, and he refuses for over 3 hours to tell the mob to leave, that's a man who can never again be entrusted with power of any kind.
So that brings us to the present. And if polls can be believed, about 45% of the electorate disagree with you. So it's not just President Trump, it's a large fraction, perhaps enough to win the presidency who don't agree with you. So what do you say to them? Not what you say to President Trump. What do you say to those who are saying 4 more years?
I say that Donald Trump, no matter what your policy views are, no matter if you are a conservative Republican or not, Donald Trump cannot be trusted with power. The power of the presidency is the most awesome power of any office anywhere in the world. And the character of the people we elect really matters. And so what I say is I understand the desire to think that you're casting a vote for conservative policies, but that isn't, first of all, he's not a conservative, and he's dangerous, and this is not a policy election. And we can talk about getting this country back on track once we get through this election cycle, but Donald Trump, if he is reelected, will be far more dangerous than we have ever seen before. He has told us he believes you can terminate the Constitution. He's gone to war with the rule of law. He repeatedly suggests that the people who assaulted and attacked the Capitol should be celebrated. He has said he will ignore the rulings of the courts. He won't leave office. He's a risk that we simply can't take, and he has to be defeated. And I say that not as a liberal Democrat, not as someone who agrees with policies on the left most of the time, but he is simply a risk that as a nation we must never take again.
So a number of people asked me to ask this question, so I'm gonna. Do you want to make news? Would you like to announce who you're endorsing in 2024?
Because we're here in North Carolina, I think it is crucially important for people to recognize not only is what I've just said about the danger that Trump poses something that should prevent people from voting for him, but I don't believe that we have the luxury of writing in candidates' names, particularly in swing states. And as a conservative, as someone who believes in and cares about the Constitution, I have thought deeply about this, and because of the danger that Donald Trump poses, not only am I not voting for Donald Trump, but I will be voting for Kamala Harris in this election. And let me say that I think that it is crucially important, and I would say especially to my fellow conservatives, that we think about the stakes, and that we think about the extent to which we have a duty to put our country and our Constitution above partisanship. We all have that duty and responsibility, and that is especially true in this election.
You did make news. So now, from that moment of joy that the audience experienced, I want to now have you harsh their mellow and talk about things you're worried about in 2024. So the 2020 elections went sideways, the post-election period. Are you concerned about similar challenges now?
I am. I think that as you look at this election process, and we've just had today the Justice Department announce indictments against Russian operatives for their efforts to interfere in this election. And I also think it's why it's so important that the margin of victory not be a small one. We know very clearly, and all you have to do is listen to Donald Trump and his supporters talk about it. We know that, they are already making efforts to attempt to sow chaos, to attempt to question the legitimacy of the election. And I would ask people, when you hear Donald Trump talk about America, talk about democracy, talk about our election process, remember that the same things that he says about American democracy are the very things that President Xi of China says about American democracy, that somehow our democracy is sick, that our democracy can't reflect the will of the people, that it's obsolete. Those are all lies. And we have an obligation, I believe, to show the world who we are, and an obligation to make sure that this election is not close. And that we do everything we can to get to the polls and vote. Young people, get to the polls and vote, get registered and vote. And I think that we're in a slightly different situation in many ways than we were in 2020 because Donald Trump's not in the Oval Office. And so he doesn't have control of the levers of power that he attempted to use last time. But I think that undoubtedly there will be efforts to try to pressure local officials not to certify. We need our court system to play the nonpartisan, crucial role that they've played to make sure that votes that are legitimate votes should be counted. And I think this is also why we have to defeat election deniers. It's not just Donald Trump, it's election deniers. Here in North Carolina, that means defeating the Republican candidate for governor. It means defeating the Republican candidate for the superintendent of public instruction here in North Carolina. But we, as a nation, as a republic, we can't elect people who will only certify elections that they agree with the results, that they win. We have to elect people who are going to be honorable and honest stewards of the public trust. And that's certainly true in this election cycle, more than it's ever been.
If you want to know how close the election will be, come back on October 22nd when we have Karl Rove and Dave Axelrod on this stage telling us what they think about the outcome of the election.
I'm going to have to call Karl ahead of time and give him some pointers.
Prime it. But if you're worried about what could go sideways, come back on the 25th of September when we're showing the movie War Game, which talks about some of the scenarios you just described with a focus on the military. So now I want to take you back to your December 2020, not yours, but the SecDef's letter. Are you worried about the military being pressed into use in this election in a different way? And that's the central focal point of that movie, The War Game, that we'll be screening.
Well, Donald Trump presented a particularly grave threat with respect to what he was willing to do with the military. And let me just say a point, because we're talking about the military and talking about policy, and Afghanistan has been in the news, and I oppose the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. I think that was a tragic decision by the Biden administration. But don't forget that Donald Trump signed an agreement with the Taliban. Donald Trump put that policy in motion. Donald Trump pressured the Afghan government to release 5,000 hardened terrorists. And Donald Trump also, we know because of the Select Committee, actually issued an order that had been drafted by the head of White House personnel to completely withdraw
Not in the chain of command, is
Yeah.
your point. Yeah, right.
Right, exactly. So the character of the people we elect matters. So I don't worry that, that President Biden would take those actions at all. And again, this goes back to, you can have policy disagreements, but at the end of the day, you've got to elect somebody you know is going to uphold the Constitution. So I think that those concerns, those don't trouble me now in the way that they did in 2020.
So a number of the folks handed in a question that's a version of this. How long before we can get back to a point where you will be booed here for saying that you are
I'm
voting?
sure it'll happen fast.
For saying that you're voting for Republicans again. So they're asking, what's the future of the Republican Party?
Look, frankly, my dream is to be booed by liberal audiences. Not really. But we used to talk about this on the Select Committee. Jamie Raskin, Congressman from Maryland, who served on the Select Committee with me, Jamie said to me, I really look forward to the days when you and I can disagree again. Mm-hmm. And I look forward to that. I in all seriousness, I think, look, we all have to recognize that we need to walk back from this toxic place where we are. And I think we all have a responsibility to do that. We all have to commit ourselves to engage in substantive debate. And I have certainly said things, when Speaker Pelosi asked me to join the Select Committee, one of her staff members, she was thinking about asking me to be on the committee. And this is unprecedented, a Democratic Speaker of the House asking a Republican to serve on this committee. And one of her staff members handed her a document, and it said, the top 10 worst things Liz Cheney has ever said about Nancy Pelosi. And
only 10.
They were bad. Well, this was the top 10.
Okay.
But to her great credit, she looked at it and she handed it back to the staff person, and she said, why are you bothering me with things that don't matter? The idea that, we all have to come together when it's the Constitution that's at risk. But so first of all, let me say, I do think that we have to commit ourselves for the good of the country to having substantive debates and discussions, not to demonizing political opponents, but also let's stop incentivizing the crazy people. We need to make sure that we're helping show support for the serious people and recognize that you're giving people a huge amount of authority when you elect them to Congress or to governorships around the country. You've got to elect serious people. But that means that we have to have serious people run for office. And we don't have enough good candidates. So everybody needs to think very carefully about running yourself. Think about putting your own name on the ballot. Think about getting engaged and getting involved, because it really matters. And then I certainly do look forward to being able to get back to debating policy. But I hope we can do it in a new way. I think about the members of Congress that I really grew to respect. And many of them were people who served with me on the Armed Services Committee. Some of them were Democrats. But members that I knew were doing their homework, that I knew if I was going to be in a debate with them, I was going to have to be prepared because they would be. But also, we would listen to each other. And I think that's a hugely important piece that's missing in our politics today. We have to be willing to listen to each other. And you have to be willing to say, you know what, that's an interesting perspective. Tell me why you believe that, and I'll tell you why I believe what I do. And I think that's how we get to a place where we're getting the best policy for our country.
I don't know if you saw John Harris's column today that said he talked to a lot of Republicans who tell him privately they think maybe it would be better for the Republican Party if President Trump loses. These are people who are publicly endorsing former President Trump, but who see the future of the Republican Party as rosier if they can get through the healing process faster. You haven't seen that piece, I take it, but what do you think of that argument? Do you think that is a view held by many current Republican political leaders?
Well, yes, I do. And, I think that just judging from, my personal experience, there were many members who told me that they would have voted to impeach, if it had been a secret ballot. The private conversations that Republicans have, often reflect the reality of the danger of Trump, which, in many ways, and I mean, like, admittedly, I'm not in a lot of those private conversations anymore, but I think it's a really important point. Like, to be in a situation where you recognize privately the threat that he poses, but rather than explain that to your constituents, explain it to voters, tell the truth about it, you're just sort of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. I mean, the way politics works is that you actually have to go and convince people. And so I don't think there's any excuse for people privately suggesting that and then publicly supporting him. Obviously, it's better for the country, better for the Constitution, and not just better, but crucial that he be defeated.
Well, and the gravamen of Harris's column is it's also better for the Republican Party's political fortunes, that 26, 28 all look brighter. It's their calculation.
Yeah, I mean,
fundraising looks better.
Yeah, I don't know that the current Republican Party can be resuscitated. Mm-hmm. I think that there's going to have to be very, very significant work done, significant change, frankly, to be able to go back to the voters and say to the voters, look, we believe in these policies, and when we tell you we support the Constitution, we're actually, we mean it. So I think I'm not convinced that the current Republican Party will survive.
So that tees up nicely a question from Ann. How do you see the country moving forward, united, when we appear to be so harshly divided? How do you get the people who will be deeply disturbed if President Trump does not win re-election, and they will believe that an election was stolen from them? There's millions, if polls can be believed, who will feel that way. How do you reach out to them?
Yeah, look, I think, well, first of all, in order to defeat him, you don't have to get 100%. And so I think it's very important that the focus be from now until the election on the election.
I think she's talking after.
Yeah, I think post-election, and I think it's really important to remember that there are really good people who have been betrayed by him. There are millions of people who have believed his lies and who have, been sucked into to this world of lies that he perpetuates. And I think that, he's tapped into a very real feeling many people have that the government doesn't listen to them, that the government is too big, that Washington is so far away, and yet they're controlling every aspect of our lives and livelihoods. And I think there's a very real, that's a real sentiment, and it's a legitimate one. And again, I think treating our fellow Americans with respect, listening to each other, but being very clear that there are some things that are outside of the bounds of our politics. And, the encouragement of violence is one of those things that we have to reject moving forward.
Well, let me make this my last question from Rahim. Earlier, you called on young people to run for election. He's putting a sharper point on it. How do you motivate them when you're asking them to put perhaps their lives at risk, or at least certainly they have to stand up in dangerous situations? So as an exit, what is your word of encouragement to the younger folks in the room about the choices that you made and that you would like them to make similarly?
I think very often about a note that I got after the impeachment vote from a Gold Star father whose son was killed in Afghanistan. And he sent me a note, and he said to me, "Standing up for truth honors all who gave all." And that's my message. My message is, we are free because people have fought and died for our freedom. People have put on the uniform of this country generation after generation. They have made the ultimate sacrifice so that we could live in freedom. And we do not have the right or the luxury to be bystanders. We can't stand by and think, you know what, somebody else is going to step into the breach, somebody else is going to do it. We have to do it. And young people have to step up. And the way that we stamp out violence in our politics is by electing people who won't stand for that, by electing people who know that the Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power has to be defended. And we all have an obligation and a duty to do that. And I think it is the most important thing that you can do when you think about making sure that the generations that come after us also get to live in a country where they don't have to worry that we're going to have violence that determines who leads this nation. But that won't happen on its own. It only happens if we get involved, if you run for office, if you vote for people who are going to uphold their oath, and if you do what's necessary to support our Constitution.
You did that. You paid a price, and I'm going to ask the audience to once more thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.